Okay, so in the last video, we're going to talk about trig equations with different functions in them. So not just single tangent, sine, whatever it might be. We're going to use a couple different ones. Once again, we'll be solving for x. We're going to round to the nearest tenth of a degree. And I shorthanded this because I got tired of writing it. X is in the interval from 0 to 360, just like we talked about before, not including 360, but including 0. All right. So the first one we're going to solve is going to look like this. 3 cosine of x, 3 times cosine of x times sine of x equals 2 sine of x. Now I want to do this one in two different ways. So the first one I'm going to show you involves collecting all the terms on one side. So I'm actually going to subtract the 2 sine of x over to the other side. But notice this is not really a like term, so I'm going to end up with 3 cosine of x sine of x, and then minus 2 sine of x. And then all of that equals 0. So now I'm going to use a factoring technique, which is just finding the GCF in order to solve this. So we'll factor out the GCF, which is sine of x, and so I end up with sine of x times 3 cosine of x minus 2 equals 0. Now we're going to use what we saw in the previous video, set each of these factors equal to 0. And so if we solve, we're going to end up with x equals sine inverse of 0, which is on the unit circle, or you can use the calculator, and also x equals cosine inverse of 2/3. So if we plug this into the calculator, you end up with 0 degrees, or the supplement, which is 180 degrees, so two solutions. This one I'm going to have to approximate, so let me get the calculator out here. We're going to end up with 2/3, let's see, cosine inverse, 48.2, or we could use negative 48.2 using those rules from section 4.7 on inverse. Now since I just did this and I know I need this in the correct interval, let's go ahead and calculate that right away. So I can just do that on the calculator real quick, and I end up with 311.8. So my solution set is once again 4 different solutions: 0, 48.2, 180, and 311.8. If you're ever unsure, you can go back and plug these into the original equation, and it should come out correct. So each side should be equal if you plug those in. So in these problems, the key is really going to be to do that GCF factoring and to recognize that each side of the equation has a similar term in it. Okay, let's take this a step further and kind of combine this with what we did in the previous video. So let's go ahead and do tangent squared of x cosine of x equals 3 cosine of x. Actually, I just remembered I said I would do the first one in a different way, so I'll go back to that first one and show you another way you could do it in a moment. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is bring that cosine of x over so that we can factor out a GCF of cosine of x. I'm left with tangent squared of x minus 3. We can set each of these factors equal to 0, so I'll go ahead and solve this right away. Cosine inverse of 0. X is going to give me 90 degrees or 270 degrees from the unit circle. Now over here, tangent squared of x minus 3, this is what we saw in a previous video. This is also going to give me 4 solutions, so we're going to have a lot of answers here. So I'm going to end up with tangent of x equals plus or minus the square root of 3, which means I'm really solving x equals tangent inverse of positive square root of 3 and x equals tangent inverse of negative square root of 3. Oh, doesn't this just make your heart go pitter patter? Look at all these great things we get to do. Yeah, math! All right. So let's go ahead. These are actually on the unit circle, but since we have our calculators here, let's just go ahead and use those. The first one gives me 60 degrees, and it also gives me 240. This one over here gives me negative 60 degrees, and it also gives me 120. Let's add 360. Oh man, this is great. So my answers are, let's start with the smallest one, which would be 60. It really doesn't matter, but I'll start with the smallest and work my way up. 60, I did 90. The next one's going to be 120, 240, 270, and then 300. Oh, great problem. All right, so the key step was factoring out that GCF, and then we ended up using some skills from the previous videos, so make sure you review all those and you end up with 6 different solutions. Now, really that concludes this video, but let's just go back to number 1 today another way. So let me go ahead and write that one down again. It was 3 cosine and 2 sine. And I want to bring this up because it might have been tempting for some of you. If you feel good about the other method, don't really worry about this. But it might have been tempting to see that there's a sine of x here, and there's also a sine of x here, which means that we end up with 3 cosine of x equals 2, which kind of saves us a step because now we just have cosine inverse of 2/3 and we get our answer. However, this ignores the situation where sine of x could actually be 0 because you can't actually divide by 0. That's why this doesn't quite work. So if you do it this way, make sure you also solve this equation. And solve each of those separately. Same thing could have happened in number 2. We could have said 3 tangent squared of x cosine of x. Oops, it wasn't 3, it was tangent squared, and then that equaled 3. So you could divide both sides by cosine, and so you'd end up with tangent squared of x equals 3, but also make sure to include cosine of x equals 0. So that way it works. It's just a word of caution. If you do that, make sure you include when it equals 0. And that concludes this section 5.3. You saw linear, you saw quadratic, and then you saw some ones with different functions where you had to factor out a GCF.